Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. For some of us, it's kind of a cold, dreary autumn day, but it sure feels like winter. Great to have you all here today. And even though it's cold and wintry for many of us, you can still grow plants in November. But of course, there are a lot of caveats to that. The type of plant, where you can plant it, and whether you should even make the effort, of course, is totally up to you. But that's what we'll be talking about today, what you can do in November in your garden. Shout out to Rick in Australia joining us at 3 a.m. For some of us, like Rick, it's springtime. This is the time of year that we are thinking about putting more and more plants into the garden and all those typical springtime activities that we like to do. But for others of us, like Lauren and Eileen in Washington, it's snowing right now, and it's snowing for Carla as well. So Oregon, Washington, they've got snow. Some of that's headed my way in Colorado. Can we really be planting when there's snow on the ground or when the temperatures are below freezing? The reason I wanted to talk about this today is because I'm seeing more and more videos on YouTube on what you can still grow in your garden and what to plant in November. And the underlying theme today for all of us will be, it depends on you and your climate and your garden as to whether you should really take advice from someone else telling you what you should grow. That's one of the things I try to stay away from. I try to tell you what you should be doing in your garden in April or August or November because all of our gardens are different. Rick is out there actively getting into the gardening mode, whereas many of us are starting to get into that put your garden to bed for the winter mode. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I look forward to seeing your discussions back and forth, because if you're still growing right now and still planting, go ahead and share that information with us. And we'll be talking about which areas of which countries are still able to grow and which of us can still grow, but maybe not outside in the garden. I have things growing indoors. You might have seen the video I did on Saturday where I set up my grow tent. I've already put a tomato plant in that grow tent. It's one of the tomato plants that I cloned, and I showed that video a few months back. So when I was cloning my tomatoes over the course of the summer, I had one that I cloned in a pot with the intent that I was going to grow that plant indoors after my garden had died, because I knew that the frosts and freezes were going to come in September and October. So now for me in November, I'm actively growing tomatoes, but I'm growing that tomato plant indoors in a grow tent. There's no way it would survive my garden outdoors. And that's one of the things that we'll be bouncing back and forth with today, is what you're willing to do to continue gardening and what kind of activities you might not be able to do because of the weather. And of course, be wary of those of you that tell you what you should be doing in your garden, because your garden is different than my garden and their garden and all the rest of our gardens. So Lie in the Garden is talking about harvesting the last of the tomatoes and peppers before the first freeze right now. And that's a good example that I've actually eaten my last fresh tomato of the year. I was able to make my tomatoes stretch for about 3 weeks after my first freeze, because I harvested the unripe tomatoes and allowed them to ripen on the kitchen counter, but I'm done. So I'm a bit jealous that you're still able to be harvesting. Even though you've got a freeze coming, hopefully you've got many weeks left that you can have before you reach that point. So let's see what else we have popping up. Hello, Creative Girl Homestead. Nice to see you here and have you as part of the chat. Donna says she's got one tomato left. So cherish it. You know, the last tomato I had really was a great way to end the season, because sometimes that last tomato can taste as good, if not better, than the first. I always love the first tomato of the season, but that last tomato I know has to last me for many months. I just don't like to buy tomatoes in the supermarket over the winter months because it's just such a terrible experience. So I usually do without. I go from the point that I eat my last tomato until I eat my first tomato the next year. And I really don't eat a lot of tomatoes in my diet in between that point. Yankee Sister, nice to see you back today. And it's a 70-degree day in Connecticut. A balmy 70 degrees. Good for you. And 70, that correlates to about 21 degrees Celsius. So we've got a couple days. It's supposed to be just a little bit less than that for us. I think tomorrow in particular, but we're getting very cold. I'll be talking a little bit more about that a little later in the show. Tammy says, my garden died off a while ago because it's been so dry and I didn't have time to get out and work in it. I always have next year, though. And, you know, and that's one of those things that I want to also have as an underlying theme, and I'll actually be finishing the show with that idea as well, that next year is always ahead of us. And so as we think about what we're growing in November, I'm often doing it with an eye on next year. So I will give you a short list of some of the plants that I start from seed and begin growing in November, indoors. And that's the key part about it, is growing indoors. A lot of herbs or herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, those are plants that take a long time to get developed. And so I'll start a lot of those types of plants in November, not the typical garden plant that we're thinking we want to grow our tomatoes and our peppers and our melons, but the herbs have a very important role in our garden, not only because it helps with all the recipes that we want to make with our fresh garden produce, but because most herbs do well for most of us in our gardens. But if you start them from seed in the soil, they can take a long time to get established. So particularly those woody herbs, the rosemary and the sage and the thyme, those are ones I'm starting well in advance. So by starting those seeds now for me in November indoors, by the time I put those plants out in my garden, typically in June, they're nice and established in the pot. They've got a good root system. I can put them in my garden and they'll take off right away. And particularly the sage and the thyme, for me, are perennial. They come back every year. The rosemary in my zone 5B garden, if I have a mild winter, the rosemary might come back, but if I have a very cold winter, the rosemaries that I typically grow don't do well without extra protection. But by starting them indoors ahead of time, it really gives me a leg up on my garden. The other plants that I'm starting indoors, well, November is my planning time. I may not actually be doing any growing of the peppers and the tomatoes, but now's the time that I start cataloging my seeds and starting to develop my plan. And so that's most of what I'm doing in my garden in November. But as you'll see with the videos that I was referring to that are on YouTube right now, if you live in the southern United States, if you're in San Diego, you can still have an active garden growing, and you can actually start more seeds and more plants. My brother lives in Arizona, and this is the time of year in Arizona that they're actually starting to grow a garden because it's just too hot during the summer months for them to grow. So it's kind of a backward system, not unlike what Rick is doing in Australia. For us, the summer months, especially in the southern United States like Arizona, are extremely hot. So you choose to grow nothing. That's what my brother does. He grows nothing during the summer months as far as a vegetable garden outdoors. Because when the temperature is up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 49 Celsius, there aren't many plants that are going to survive that kind of heat. And if they do survive, they're not pollinating the flowers and you're not getting anything out of the crops. And so instead, they treat their summer months kind of like the rest of us are treating our winter months. And then when October and November come, that's when they're starting their vegetable garden. A lot less light. The plants will take longer because they're not getting the intensity of the sunlight that they might get in the summertime. But because it's cooler, they can grow those plants. And in those parts of the United States, it doesn't freeze at night. It's not getting so cold during the winter months that they have to worry about their plants dying. So what can you plant in November? It depends on where you are. If you are up in the cold north, like the Two Gals Vermont homestead that I saw has joined the chat, I'm guessing Vermont has probably already had snow. I lived in northern Maine for 4 winters, and there's nothing that you can be growing outdoors in this time of year. So we're not growing, but other areas are growing. And where do you fit in that picture? That's one of the things I want to talk about today as you share what you're doing in your garden and what the plants are that you're growing, so we can get an idea of where we are. Gardener Cat in Northern California in Zone 9A. It's a nice zone to be able to have these options. I can relate to your brother. 117 here in Northern California. Wow, that's about 46 degrees Celsius. I'm ready to stop doing the summer garden. 0 tomatoes during the summer. We got our first freeze here last week, though. And so that's interesting. So it can still get cold, assuming the 9A means that you're in zone 9A there, Cat. But all it takes is a little bit of protection. So if you're in one of those zones that will still get cold in winter, but not the frigid cold like those of us in zone 5, covering your garden beds with hoops and plastic can be enough to get the plants through those cold nights. And then you've got the warm days to get everything growing. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you will be growing and what you're having this year. There's the 2 gals from Vermont, and actually been a mild year this year, sunny and warm. Interesting. So the plants are confused. I'm not surprised by that. So, and there's Tron joining us today. Nice to see you here as well from Vietnam. So, particularly for those of you that are new viewers, I always talk about the global audience that we have that comes to this chat every Monday. So Tron is in Vietnam, Rick is in Australia, Jean-Pierre is in Belgium. Of course, we've got a number of people that have already checked in from Canada and then all over the United States. So this truly is a global audience. And that's why I like to talk about these subjects where we can identify that we all have these same concerns. In November, what are we going to do? And I suggest to you that you don't rely on a YouTube channel that doesn't match your garden when they tell you what you should be doing in your garden in the various months of the year. And that's why I'm interested to see what you all are actually doing in your garden, in your respective climates and countries and zones. Linda's got 27 degrees, so that's below freezing. That's about -4 degrees Celsius, and that's pretty close to the temperature that I woke up to this morning. So we don't have snow. We don't have snow in the forecast, but it's definitely cold. Reverend Kai having a second spring like we did last year. Plants seem to adapt okay. I'm just harvesting and trusting things will be okay. And so great example. And you'll be seeing this in a video I've got coming out later this week where I talk more about weather and how you start tracking your weather. And I always suggest that you have a garden journal so you can keep track of the past and what's happening in your garden as well. Because the second spring, I'm guessing for you that this may become a regular pattern. It's certainly a regular pattern here in Colorado. And so that's one of the things I've learned in my garden, that in September, usually, we'll have our first frost. And then it warms up for 2 or 3 weeks before we get our first freeze. And so if I can just protect my plants for that first frost with the hoop and plastic, then I get another 3 weeks in my gardening season. And so that's why, like, for November, for those of you that are in the zone 9 or zone 8 or even zone 10, with the weird weather we all seem to be having, if you get a dip like that where it's getting down close to the frost point or maybe even touching the freeze point, if you can just protect your plants that one night, that may be enough to continue growing your garden for weeks afterward. But you need to track it. You need to start recognizing those weather patterns in each successive year. And just a little modification in how you garden can make a huge difference in the success and the harvest, of course, that you're going to be having. Looks like Chris is in Vermont as well. 76 degrees yesterday. That's 24 Celsius. And then 20 at night for Wednesday. No regular pattern. So yeah, 20 is -7 Celsius. That's definitely cold. And that matches relatively close to what we have around here. I've been enjoying a 40-degree Fahrenheit temperature change. And so a 50 or 56 degree temperature change is a big variation in Vermont. And that's why those of us that have these kind of weather patterns, we're not growing outdoors, because it's just too crazy. The plants won't survive, but it drives us crazy even attempting to help our plants survive. And it's only when it gets close to the freezing point that we can really have some good success protecting our plants. When it drops well below that point, I just give up. It's not worth the effort, because I know I can't give my plants the kind of protection that they definitely need. Tiffany is in Texas, zone 8A. Glad to see you're getting some rain. My son is in Louisiana, and they've actually been enjoying some rain this last week as well. So glad to hear everything is thriving for you. And it's one of those kind of things that if you're living in one of those regions where at this time of year everything is thriving, go for it. And if you can plant more, and take full advantage of the fact that you live in a climate that allows you to grow those kind of things. But don't lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of us that are no longer growing, and vice versa. Those of us that are no longer growing, don't lose sight of the fact that there's still a lot of gardeners out there that are actively growing and getting the benefits of their harvests. And so that's why I really like this global community, because we recognize and can recognize that we're all on the same journey, but it's at a different time on that journey, or a different location on that journey. And so learning from the people, so the channels that are showing what you can do in November, they still have good techniques on how to start their seeds. They still have good techniques on putting the plants in and why they choose the plants they are. It might not match up with what you're doing in your garden, but you can still learn from people that are living in a different region and growing at a different time than maybe some of the rest of us are. Brett Lee is in zone 6 in St. Louis, I think that is, and get the same roller coaster weather this time of year starting in late September. I do the same, where protect them from freeze for a few nights and get a good few more weeks. So yeah, exactly. So once you learn that that's the way to do it, then I think it really makes it easier. For those of you that are new to gardening and maybe had a good year, maybe had a bad year, this is the kind of thing to start putting in your bag of tricks each successive year as you recognize what's happening, what kind of climate you actually live in, and how it impacts your garden. And that's why I'm always interested in what others are doing and what they're growing and what kind of success they're having. And so Jay DeVries is asking, what good table grapes grow on the eastern plains of Colorado? And so I've actually had some really good success with Concord grapes. And I'm right on the edge of the Colorado plains here on the Front Range of Colorado. And I've been trying a couple other varieties, and they just don't seem to take as well. I have bought my grapevines from a few different nurseries online, primarily with lots of different recommendations. I'll read the catalog, and it'll say does well in cold winters or does well in dry areas. And I've had mixed results, not always good results, with most of the grapes I've grown, with the exception of Concord. And so that's my go-to grape here for me in Colorado is Concord. And I like to take the Concord grapes, both the seeded and the seedless, and make grape jelly. And it's better than any jelly you can buy in the store, of course. But as a table grape, just sitting there and eating fresh Concord grapes that you harvested yourself, just like everything else we harvest, it's just so much better than anything else we can find. So that's the only one I've had success with here in Colorado. But you can go online to the different nurseries and look through their catalogs. And if you read the catalogs, some of them do suggest that they can have good results in the cold winters. I haven't found another grape yet that actually does well for me. Carla says, I look at what others are doing and save the information for later. Exactly. I've learned much from Mark in Australia from Self-Sufficient Me, and Steve in Nova Scotia with Optimistic Gardener, both good channels, even though I'm in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you, Carla. That's exactly my point. And that's the way I look at it too, is to look around the world and recognize what they're doing and how they're doing it, and not necessarily trying to match it with when they're doing it. And so that's the same on my channel. And I have people commenting all the time on my videos of the way my garden looks or when I'm doing something. And it's the same thing. I'm doing things in June that others might be doing in April. And I'm doing things in September that others might be doing in October. And so don't get too wrapped up in the when of the information that you find out there. It's all about the what and the why that I think are much more important. And so this is the time of year, like I've talked about the last couple of weeks, this is the time of year to really start ramping up your learning curve if you're going into winter. And if you're not actively growing in your garden, this is the time of year to start, like Carla says, get the information and save it for later. Save it for a time when it is appropriate and it does match with what you're doing in your garden. And I'm, of course, chomping at the bit, trying to do everything I can to actually have plants growing, because it's going to be another 6-7 months more likely before I've actually got anything growing outside again in my garden, because it is just going to be a cold winter. And that's just the pattern I know. My garden is put to bed in October, and it doesn't wake up again until April. That's pretty much the pattern I have. And so that's what I have to play with. And Chris has a good idea, great time to be adding leaf mulch to the garden. And so I love using leaf mulch. It's free, it comes from the trees, it's part of nature. Leaves are packed full of minerals that compost might not have. And it's a great mulch for the garden. So completely agree with you, Chris. Completely agree. That's a great idea of what some of the things you can be doing. So let's see what we have. I'm scrolling back up to see what we might have, or what I might have missed. See if I can answer any of the questions. New Georgia Gardener is wondering, when your broccoli starts forming a head, how long before it gets to full size? So it depends on the variety of broccoli you're growing. I grew some broccoli this year that only formed the heads, or only formed heads that were going to be about 3 inches in diameter. And so look at the seed packet, or look at the catalog, or wherever you got your seeds to start growing the broccoli, and it should tell you the size of the head. And that's what you should be looking for, is recognizing how big the head is going to get. And then this is where you start tracking how long it takes. So for me, with those 3-inch size broccoli heads, it only took about a week from the time that they started forming until they were ready to harvest. Whereas some of the bigger heads, like the 6 and 7 inch diameter heads of broccoli that I've grown in the past, it might take 2 or 3 weeks before those are growing to the point that you can harvest. But not unlike so many plants we grow, it can happen overnight. So this is one of those things that you'll need to start tracking probably on a daily basis to see how big the broccoli heads are growing. And then, of course, get an idea of the size they should be. And as soon as they start opening up, so the broccoli heads will open up, and then they don't look like broccoli anymore. And that's when the flowers start getting set on the plant. So look to make sure and you harvest before, while the broccoli head is still nice and tight, because even if it doesn't reach the full size that you're expecting, if those little green tips start to open up, it's time to start harvesting the broccoli. And it usually takes a couple weeks, but it does depend on the specific variety that you're wanting to grow, or that you are actively growing. So, Mr. Kilo Baked, truth or myth, should you add black walnut leaves to compost? So, it's a truth or it's a myth, depending on how you're asking the question. So usually the question is, can you add black walnut leaves to compost? And the generally accepted answer is no, and that's a myth. However, there's another part of it as well. Should you add leaves to your compost? And in general, I'm not a big fan of adding leaves to the compost. And so here's why. So compost breakdown, the decomposition of all that organic matter that's in compost, is primarily done by bacteria. And the bacteria is breaking down the carbon in the material and using nitrogen to break down everything that they're eating as part of the breakdown in a compost pile. And the temperature gets very, very high if you're running a hot compost pile, because the thermophilic bacteria generates heat. Leaves have a different type of structure, very high in carbon. So if you want to add dried leaves to your compost pile as a carbon source, it is a great carbon source. And you can actually add green leaves to your compost pile as a nitrogen source. Both great options. But because of the structure of the leaves, they take longer to break down. And particularly when they're dry, they're broken down better by fungi. That's why it's I think, a better idea to take your leaves and turn them into leaf mold, as I showed in a video in this last year and 2 years ago as well, where I took my leaves and made leaf mold, because that is a fungally driven decomposition. And so when you put the leaves in your compost pile, because they don't break down well when it's the bacteria doing the breakdown, all of your compost will be done, but you'll still have chunks of leaves left in your compost. And that's why, in general, adding leaves to the compost pile is not something that I necessarily would recommend. But specifically for black walnut leaves, there's a chemical that the black walnut tree exudes. It's juglone. And juglone is known to kill lots of other plants. And so I'm guessing that's why you're asking this question, is because of the juglone concern. And if you add that to the compost, is it going to create a problem when you use that compost on the rest of the garden? And the answer is no. The juglone actually dissipates relatively quickly once the leaves dry. So it's the tree and the roots that are exuding this chemical that will deter other plants growing in the same area. Once that chemical dries in the dried leaves, it dissipates. Once it gets into the soil, it dissipates. Once it gets into the compost pile, it dissipates. So adding black walnut leaves to compost, or even using them as a mulch in your garden, is really not as big an issue as a lot of people think of. So that's why I say that it's a myth to be using it. But the concern is relatively valuable, because eucalyptus leaves, like in California, same kind of concern. There's that chemical that the eucalyptus will exude to kill other plants, and so people say don't use it in your garden. Well, you can. You just have to understand that those chemicals will dissipate in time, and you can use those dried leaves or even the wood chips. The wood chips of a black walnut tree or a eucalyptus tree can also be used as mulch. There just needs to be a slight period of time for the chemicals to dissipate, and they don't become a problem anymore. So hope that helps out. I know that's a long answer that talks probably more than what you were expecting about the compost aspect of it and also the chemical aspect of it. But I would go ahead and just take those leaves and, assuming you got a lot of leaves, start a leaf mold pile. Takes longer than compost, but it really creates a really nice, rich material that you can use throughout your garden. And that's actually my preferred way to use it as well. Dan says, oh no, I made a compost bin that's mainly grass clippings and leaves. It's getting hot over 145 degrees. I don't think that's an oh no at all. If you can get your pile above 140 degrees, that's 60 Celsius, then you're doing everything right. You've got a good mix of the greens and the browns, the nitrogen and the carbon. And because if you don't have the right mix, then the thermophilic bacteria aren't ever going to reach that point that they start generating that much heat. So I wouldn't say an oh no at all. I think it's great. If you don't want it to get that hot, you can always cool off the pile by just turning it. Just getting in there and incorporating a little more oxygen, that'll help cool down the pile, and it'll heat back up again. Once all the food is eaten by the bacteria, it'll naturally start cooling down. But I say congratulations, Dan. I think that's awesome. I haven't had a lot of success getting my piles that hot because I don't spend that much time on it. I like the slow, lazy composting method because it's less work. But I hope the oh no is an exclamation of like you weren't expecting it, and it's a good thing, because it really is a good thing if you're trying to get a hot pile. I think that's fantastic. So hey, back at you, Green. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but I'll have to do a translate when we're done here and see what you are. So hey, right back at you. Nice to see everybody around. And so yeah, Gardens Happen is talking about the allelopathic chemicals. That's what the juglone. That's the name for those type of chemicals like the juglone in the black walnut tree. They will break down and become inert in compost. If it's a concern, just let that compost break down for a while. There you go. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And always nice to be substantiated when I'm talking about things. And so let's see what we have as I scroll down. Dan was saying the comment about not using leaves worried me. My hope is by spring to have some nice compost for planting. Absolutely. And so, that's why I'd say it's okay to use the leaves in the compost pile. You just have to have the right balance. If you don't have enough nitrogen, it's going to take a long time to break down, and it's going to be broken down by the bacteria rather than the fungi. I guess the main reason, and I talked about this in that video about the leaf mold, a good garden soil should have a balance of both bacteria and fungi in the soil. And so if you're adding compost to your soil, you're adding a lot of bacteria. And not all the bacteria that thrive in a compost pile will thrive in your soil, but you help make a bacterial-rich soil in your garden. When you add leaf mold, which is a fungally rich material to your soil, you're incorporating the fungi. And so if you have a balance between the bacteria and the fungi, it really benefits the plants, and it really makes your plants grow better. If you do just compost, you'll be just fine. Most gardeners just use compost and everything is good. If you're just using compost, this is a great time to start thinking about using a leaf mulch on your garden, because as those leaves break down, it's the fungi that are going to start increasing their population in your soil. And so a leaf mulch can really benefit your soil from that perspective as well. And so rather than putting my leaves in compost and allowing the bacteria to break it down, because the fungus or that is breaking down that particular leaf can't survive the high temperatures in a compost pile. The leaf is still going to break down, but it may not fully break down, and you're missing out on the opportunity of incorporating the fungi into your soil. So that's more the reason why I don't think adding leaves to compost is the best option for me in my garden. But there's nothing wrong with it, especially if you can get a pile going that hot, then it shows you're doing everything right. You've got a good balance, even if you're using leaves. So don't think it's a don't do it situation. Just think about it's not the way I do it, and maybe you might want to consider doing it a little bit different. That's just a different way to look at it. Dusty Flats added crushed oak leaves to clay soil that was delivered, and in 1 year it turned to workable loam. Exactly. And that's the idea, is that it's the fungi in that soil that's breaking down those leaves. And so, especially for a clay soil, a dense soil, one of the best ways to improve that kind of soil is to put in those woody materials. If you put in the compost, the compost will probably break down and dissipate much faster than any other material like leaves that you put in. So it's finding that balance. And I don't normally recommend putting wood chips into soil, but with the same idea. If you've got a clay soil that just isn't any good and you want to improve it, leaves and small wood chips can actually get you a little bit faster to better soil. Like just was pointed out, within a year it can turn into loam. So that actually can be a good thing to be doing. Brendan Laird, is fall and winter an okay time to start a compost pile? I live in a cooler, rainy climate and don't expect much sun until spring. Absolutely. And so the sun isn't necessary for the breakdown of a compost pile. It comes down to that mix of the nitrogen and the carbon materials. And you can start at any time of year. The limitation for many of us is the material. For a compost pile to really start breaking down, for it to get those high temperatures, it needs to be at least 1 meter wide, 1 meter high, and 1 meter deep. And so you need some volume in your compost pile for it to start breaking down. If you've got enough material, if you've got the dried material and the green material, and you can start a nice big pile like that now, go for it. And even in winter, when it gets cold, if you've got a good balance, and if you've got a moist pile, so it sounds like because you've got a rainy climate, your pile will probably be moist enough. If you incorporate the oxygen, that's the other thing that these plants or that these bacteria need. They need the food, they need the oxygen, and they need the water. If you can get that in a good balance, in the peak of winter, you can have a nice hot compost pile with no sun and with snow outside, and that compost can be ready to be used in the garden in springtime. It involves some work. It might involve going outside when it's raining or going outside when it's colder, but you can definitely start a compost pile in November and let it cook with your aid over the course of the winter and be ready in the springtime. For me, I'm not doing that much work. I don't like going out in the cold and the snow in my garden. And so I'm adding all the material to start a new compost pile right now, but it's going to be a slow pile. It's not going to reach those high temperatures. I'm not going to be out turning it. And then come springtime, I already have a good volume in place, partially broken down, and that's when I start devoting more attention to it so that I can get that final breakdown before I put it into my garden. So I say, Brendan, if you've got the material, go for it, and either take the fast approach where you do a lot of work with and get a hot pile with those high temperatures, or you just take the slow approach like I do. You got the material sitting there, and then you can get back to it in the spring and put more work to it. So absolutely a good idea. So Chris is wondering, where's the coffee? So I have my tea. I'm too busy talking to actually remember to drink it. So I hope you have your coffee there, Chris. So let's see. I thought you were talking about something else, Shanky's sister. I see that you're responding to Dusty Flats. Patty Barr says, I've spent days cutting up cardboard for compost. It was worth it. There you go. And so if you're going to add something like a big brown component based on everything I just said, I prefer to add cardboard to my compost pile than to add leaves to my compost pile. The cardboard breaks down much faster, especially if you tear it into small pieces, and it adds a really good carbon component. And it's based on trees, so it's essentially the same material as a leaf, but it does break down much quicker, so that's actually a good idea. TJ DeHawk, any opinions on ordering compost from other places if you don't have enough for your garden? Yes, of course, I've got opinions. If it's about gardening, I've got an opinion. So it depends on the source. And so I have ordered compost in bulk from one of my local sand companies. They sell sand and rock and compost and mulch. And I've ordered some compost from them in the past and wasn't that impressed with it. Because it's a lot like the compost that you'll often buy that comes in a bag. And you read the ingredients and it says forest products. And so there are a lot of companies out there that will take the wood shavings or the material that's left over from a lumber mill, and also bark and just chunky wood, and they pack that, or I should say they stack that into big piles and keep it moist, and it breaks down and it turns into chunky compost, and then they put it in a bag or they distribute it to a company like the sand company I buy from, and it's compost, but it's primarily composted wood, and it's got a lot of chunks in it. And so when you add something like that to your garden, you're adding that fungally dominant kind of material. You're not adding that really rich bacterial material that comes from when we are composting our grass and our banana peels and all of those type of things, all the stems and the leaves from your garden. I prefer a finer, looser kind of compost that's made from the leafy material rather than the woody material. That being said, as well, you might have a compost pile that your city or your town does. My town does the same thing in some areas, but they usually use the clippings from trees to start that compost. And so my opinion in general is that the compost is not as good as that you can buy. Now, I do get bagged compost that is made from manure. And so if you can find a material that is like a dairy cow compost, then I prefer that over some of those other types of composts that you might buy. It all comes down to the material that's being used to make the compost and the source that is producing that compost. That really makes a difference. So when you're ordering compost, it might come from like the sand company that I order a lot of things from or have ordered in the past. But before I used that compost, I went to the site and physically checked to see what it was, and I was okay with that. Now, some of the places in my area, and you're seeing a lot more of this, particularly in Oregon and Washington here in the United States, where they're using, there's different names for it, but it's a biocompost that is being made from the human waste that's coming out of treatment facilities. And everything I've read so far, all the research, all of the data shows that that's perfectly safe to use in your garden. It becomes philosophical as to whether you want to use human waste from a treatment plant. But some of the compost that you'll be ordering, to get around that concern that some people have, they're mixing the two. So they're mixing the compost that's made from the forest products with the biocompost that comes from a treatment plant. And then that's what they're selling as compost. Safe to use. It's one of those things that there might be some heavy metals involved with the biocompost. I haven't seen anything yet that says that's at a dangerous level, but be aware that that's why you should check out the source and why you should check on where the compost comes from to see if it matches with how you want to use the compost. So there's a few opinions for you, TJ. I don't have a problem with ordering compost if you can't make enough of your own compost. And I've yet to be able to make enough of my own compost to use throughout my garden. I don't live in Great Britain like Charles Dowding on acres where I can have tons of compost that I make yearly. I would love to be able to do that, but I just don't have the biomass in my area to generate that much compost. So when I add compost to my garden, I always start with my own. I use my own leaf mold, but if I need more, I'll buy a compost. And I prefer to use the manure-based compost because it breaks down and is better for the soil. I just don't like the chunky, woody compost if I can avoid it. Shandy's garden got several bags of compost that I've had for a while, and they actually have worms in them now because they sat so long. That's good. I like that. You know, I've had that happen a couple times too. I had someone suggest years ago that if you're buying bags of compost in particular and you don't think you're going to use them for a while, to put slits in the bottom of the bag and put those slits on the soil at whatever location in your garden that you're storing your bags. And it's for that reason exactly, that with the slits in the bag, the soil life will actually work its way into those bags of compost. And so it's the bacteria, it's the fungi, it's the earthworms, it's all that kind of wonderful activity that they'll find your bags of compost if you lay them on the ground. And so I don't know if the worms may have been in the bag when they bagged it, or if maybe you had a hole in the bag, but that's nice. I actually think that helps show that compost is good to use in your garden because the worms are there too. Gardener Cat is wondering, anyone else here absolutely bonkers for amaryllis bulbs too? I ordered about 5 new bulbs every year, and as they throw out babies, I've had dozens now. I'm okay with it. I'll force some for Christmas. Fantastic. I haven't grown amaryllis that much. I did at my last house, and I did it around this time of year, primarily for the Christmas flowering, because it is one of those things to have the nice flowers. That is something you could be doing in November. You could be growing amaryllis as you anticipate the Christmas holidays coming up. So I wouldn't say I'm bonkers for it, but I'm glad to hear that you're bonkers, because that is one of those nice things that you can be growing in November and actually see the benefits as they start to flower. Brian says, my first year gardening, I bought some local compost and found out they use grass from lawn companies as a nitrogen source, along with all the lawn chemicals. That's a good point, Brian. That's why I say it helps to know the source, because if they're using something that might have a chemical sprayed on the lawn, and if that's a kind of chemical that is a broadleaf herbicide, and you put that right away into your garden, then you might be incorporating a broadleaf herbicide into your garden and kill all those broadleaf plants like lettuce and spinach and broccoli and all the root vegetables and the tomatoes and basically everything but corn. So yeah, you'd have to be careful about that. And one of the things I like to do with my straw, I've talked about this in the past as well as whatever bags I'm using. If I'm buying compost, I'm buying it at this time of year. And then I'm putting it into my soil at this time of year, knowing that it's going to be 6 to 7 months before I'm going to be putting any plants into that bed. Just about everything, just about every chemical that could pose a problem has a half-life of less than a year, and most are less than 6 months. And so if there is chemical residue that survived the composting process and survived the bagging process and now is coming to your garden, if you put it into your garden with at least 6 months before you're going to use it, then it really shouldn't be an issue. But But it is a concern, absolutely a concern, as Brian raises. And that's why if you check the source, and if I found out that I got some compost with potentially contaminated ingredients, I would let it sit for months before I decided to use it in my garden. Okay, let's see what we have. Linda says, just joined. Nice to have you here, Linda. We're traveling in beautiful Austin, Texas. Loving the warm weather. At home in Cottage Grove, Oregon. It's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.5 degrees Celsius. So enjoy your travels. Stay safe. And Austin, of course, is a wonderful town. So I'm sure you're enjoying that trip as well. So let's see. Rick is saying Charles Downing does still require to buy some compost. Just said it the other evening on his November tour. Oh, I haven't seen that video yet. So interesting. Wow. Well, he's got, such large beds, and he grows a lot. And I know he's got like 6 or 8 of those huge bins where he makes his compost. But that's interesting that he also has to buy some. So thanks for sharing that, Rick. I was unaware of that. But it just goes to show, the best of us that love using compost and make our own compost, often we can't make enough and we do have to buy. So just make sure you're aware of your source, and things should be okay. And as long as you are okay with whatever it is you find. Michelle's wondering, any recommendations in creating money/renting a machine to create wood chips for the compost pile? I live in an urban setting, would like to utilize the sticks and branches around the neighborhood. Absolutely. In fact, the first big tool that I bought when I started seriously gardening about 25 years ago here in Colorado was a chipper shredder for that exact reason. And so I still have it. It's got a broken blade, so I don't use it like I should. I need to fix the blade so I can use it again. But yeah, you can rent chipper shredders, but they're not that expensive, depending on the size of the stick that you want to chip up. And I used that chipper shredder for years to create mulch, to break down leaves. So when I talk about crushed leaves, putting leaves through a chipper shredder is a great way to get them to that small crushed size that you would be either using as a mulch or putting it into your soil. And so look into chipper shredders, chipper/shredder, and you can get some. I've seen some less than $100 that are very small, that are made for very small branches. The one I bought, now this is 25 years ago, but 25 years ago, I think it was like $150 or $160, and it could handle branches that were like 3 inches thick. I never did that because the one time I did it, it just really stressed the machine. But I did 2-inch thick branches all the time and 1-inch thick regularly. It all depends on the size of the engine, or if it's an electric motor, because you can get both gas and motor, or gas and electric. Mine was gas powered. And so look into it there, Michelle, because it might be worth the investment to make your own mulch and to also chip things down so you can put them into a compost pile. Great tool. I actually don't think I've really talked much about that in the past, but that is one of those next level gardening tools that you can add and really take advantage of the free materials all around you. So go for it. I think that's definitely something. So yeah, Sunset Gazing says probably made in the USA. Absolutely. It was a Craftsman. I bought it at Sears. So still have it, still remember it. And it's held up all these years. It just has a broken blade. So, that's one of those things. Best of plans is I actually got a welder to learn welding because I wanted to fix that blade, and never ended up doing any of that. So anyway, Dusty Flat says, don't get a small chipper shredder. It won't last and they're frustrating. Okay, thank you for that. I've never had them. I've just seen them. So thank you. As with most tools, I think spending the extra money to get the quality product that will last for years is a better idea. So I agree with you there, Dusty Flats. And thank you for doing that. Linda's got a McKissick chipper shredder that handles 3 inches or below, called a Mighty Mac, and we love it. There you go. So lots of good ideas about chipper shredders, because it is one of those kind of things that we don't talk much about, because I think that's one of those tools that most gardeners don't think about. And so there you have it. We're thinking about it. We're talking about it, and put it on your gift list this year. Maybe you'll find a chipper shredder under the tree. It's always one of those things that is nice if you can ask for it and get it. Frank says, I found Lowe's has seed racks out nearly 2 months early. Wow, got another round of snap peas, turnips, radishes, and next year's onions. Good for you. I've noticed all of the stores at any time of year are putting things out even earlier than they were. So it's still too cold in my Lowe's. They're putting everything on clearance if there's anything left in the garden center. But that's good for you if you can find a nice sale, and especially if you can get started earlier, go for it. And so, at this November time frame, if you live in an area where you can start seeds indoors now to put out in February or March, you might have difficulty finding the seeds. And so that's one of those things where they might be putting them out 2 months earlier for you now, because they're recognizing that there is a demand, that more and more gardeners are starting plants indoors, and maybe they've lost out on some opportunity in the past, and that's why they're starting early. I'm seeing that more and more here in Colorado. We start our tomato seeds generally in March or early April. And it used to be that the seeds wouldn't hit the stores until mid-April. And I'm starting to see, at least here, that some of the seeds are starting to show up in February, because they're recognizing that you can't really grow a tomato and a pepper unless you grow it from seed, and it has to be done indoors 2 or 3 months early before putting outdoors. So start looking for those kind of things as you start touring around town to your different stores, and you're thinking about what you're going to grow. I wouldn't be surprised if more and more stores don't put those racks out for all of us, and then we can go with it. John Jude has a 7 horsepower chipper mulcher. Great, but any dry, hard limbs are a challenge, and welding helps my gardening. Good to hear it. Yeah, I need to do more with my welding ambitions. The biggest issue I had, it's a chipper shredder, and so when you put the big branches in, it's chipping away at that big branch, and it just takes forever and puts a lot of strain on the engine. Whereas when you put in a smaller branch, it might be called chipping, but it's breaking. It just cuts it into chunks as the cutting wheel is turning. And so it's called a chipper shredder, but I think it's more of a chunker for a lot of the material that we end up putting in, just because of the way the wheel happens to work. Jonathan Gordon bought several cubic meters of compost from the city's transfer station, but I found too much bits of plastic and broken glass. Good point. I should have actually mentioned that when we were talking about the source and what cities have to offer, because particularly if a city has a compost pile or a mulch pile, my city does mulches more than it does the compost. But they just take the material that's been donated and they put it into their machines and they chip it up and they put it into piles, and then they let the bacteria go to work. And if there's glass or plastic or wire, I've found wire in it before, it's going to be there when you put it into your garden. So if you can find a clean source, by all means, go with it. But I'm not surprised, Jonathan. That is very common. I've heard a lot of other people talk about that in the past as well. They find something in that city pile because they're not sifting it out beforehand. They're just throwing it all and making it available for you to come pick up. So they're not that worried about what's in it, I guess. Okay, let's see. Nice to see so much information. I didn't even think we'd be going in the direction of chipper shredders today, but nice to see that you've been talking about it, and lots of good suggestions back and forth. Llama Llama says, I think I have all my seeds for next year. Of course, I haven't seen the new seed catalog, so that's likely to change. The struggle is real. I have been thinking that way too. I've got all my seeds. I'm just going to do next year's garden with just the seeds I have. And that's what I spend November as a big part of my gardening. I'm not actually planting outside, but I'm thinking about what I'm planting. And I start getting my seeds together. And I decided this year that's what I was going to do, was only grow next year what I have this year. And much of what I'm planning to grow next year, I have. But as I start thinking about what my garden's going to look like, there are gaps. And I don't have the seeds of some of the plants I want to grow. I want to do some videos and do a big section of my garden next year where I'm growing determinate tomato plants so that I can get the big harvest and make the sauces and the paste and show you how that whole process works with determinate tomatoes. Because so far, all of my videos, with the exception of one video where I talk about pruning, and I do have some determinate tomatoes in that video, but all the rest of my tomato videos are all indeterminate tomato plants. And I've got tons of seeds for those plants. So as I'm planning my garden for next year, thinking, oh, I've got all my seeds, but I want to do the determinate tomatoes, and I don't have determinate tomato seeds, so I need to buy some more. So you can plan, but there's always that thing that comes up that you ain't going to end up buying, which is why some of us have hundreds of seed packets, because there's always that thing we want to try, and then we're left with more and more seeds. So it's definitely a challenge. Yeah, Heidi says, I say that every year, and I see all the new seed varieties, and that goes out the window. Yeah, I completely agree with you. This is a challenging time of year, especially when those racks go up early and you see something new and decide it's something that you definitely have to have. So while I'm thinking about it, I want to go ahead and talk about the background today. So this is my garden this morning. And so as I mentioned earlier, it's about 27 degrees, I think, when I took this picture. And so that's about -3 Celsius. And it's a foggy day. It's a cold day. And it was nice out in the garden. You can't see Mala in this picture. She was standing right by me. She doesn't care whether it's cold or not. She loves going outside. But my temperature is definitely changing. On Saturday, my forecast is supposed to be 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -11 Celsius. And so that's one reason why I wanted to talk about this subject today of what you can grow in your garden in November. Because if I were to take the advice of some of the people out there telling me that I can put my fall garden seeds in now, there is no fall garden plant that will survive those cold temperatures. And so that's why I say you have to figure out for yourself what you can grow and what your climate can support, because you always need to be looking ahead to the forecast and what the temperature is actually going to be when those plants start growing. And so for me, even if the temperatures haven't been as cold as they are, we've had a relatively mild fall so far here in Colorado. It hasn't been too bad, but it all comes to an end this weekend. The temperatures are going to be so cold that it's going to kill virtually everything that still has any life in my garden at this point. That's just too cold. Plants just can't survive that. And so, I still see some green. These are my raspberry plants in the background here. There's still some green on the asparagus plants. They're yellowing and they're starting to turn brown, but they're going to be completely dead at this time next year because of the cold. And so just be wary when someone that doesn't live in your area recommends what you should be planting at any time of year, because you just need to make sure that it matches with what your garden can actually support. And so when I talk about those cold temperatures at -12 degrees Fahrenheit, that is so cold that, so we're talking November and I still have a lot of winter to come. So for me here in my Zone 5B garden, Zone 5B means that in winter it gets down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit as an average lowest temperature. If I were in Zone 6, that would be -5 degrees Fahrenheit. if I was in zone 7, that would be a 5 degree. If I were in zone 8, that would be a 15 degree. So this weekend, I'm already out of the coldest that zone 8 is going to see, venturing into the coldest that zone 7 is going to see, and pretty soon I'm going to be venturing into the coldest that zone 6, and then ultimately what zone 5 is going to be. So it really becomes a factor when you start thinking about plants like perennial plants, because you can still put bulbs in the ground in November. Even here in Colorado, I could still put some bulbs in the ground. It's a little bit late, but it is one of those activities that you can often do in November. And so, especially if you're in zone 7 or 8, you can probably be planting bulbs, that the spring flowering bulbs. You can be doing that right now in fall. It's a little bit late for me. I would be taking a little bit of a gamble, because when you're putting the bulbs in fall, it's like the garlic. We talked about the garlic recently, where the intent of planting in the fall is so that the bulb starts growing some roots and then goes dormant through the winter. And then in the spring, those roots are already present, and then the plant starts growing, and hopefully you get the spring flowers if you're planting the flowering bulbs. But they need to go in the ground early enough that those roots can start developing before the soil freezes. When you get cold temperatures like I'm talking about, my ground is going to start freezing starting this weekend. So even though you might be told that you can plant bulbs in November, you have to balance that with what your actual weather is going to be and what zone you're in as to how cold it's going to get and when the soil is going to freeze to determine really the best time to do it. And so that's why I say I'm done with the gardening for the year. I do have, I just got a new head of garlic last night that I'm going to be putting into a container, and I decided I'm going to grow it. And it actually is a bulb of Gilroy garlic that was bought in Gilroy. So I thought, oh, I need to go ahead and plant this and grow some actual Gilroy garlic. And it can grow in a container because I can bring the container inside when it gets really cold, like we're talking about, and allow a little bit more time for those roots to develop. So in containers in November, you might be able to get away with planting some of the things that you wouldn't be able to grow in a raised bed or an in-ground bed. So don't fully discount the idea that you can't plant anything in November in a really cold area like mine, or even colder, like with some of the zone 4 and Vermont area that we're talking about in Washington. You might not want to do some of the in-ground stuff, but maybe container gardening could be a viable option. So keep that door open. And those are the kind of videos I would be looking for right now if I were looking to start planting more in the garden. Yankee Sister, always nice to have you here, and so glad you're back. Happy Veterans Day to me. Thank you so much. And all the other vets in the chat. Be honored in City Hall this Friday. Awesome for you. Thank you for all of your great service. Absolutely. And thank you to everyone out there in every service aspect. I know that Veterans Day is really focused on the military veterans in particular, but I like to think of it as a time to just give thanks to anyone who is serving, whether that was military or not. But thank you, Yankee Sister. Always nice to have you here, and thank you for that super chat. I do appreciate it, and I do appreciate you. And when you can be here, we do miss you when you're not here. So always nice to be back. Sunset Gazing says, I echo your sentiments, thanking all active and retired military service people. And everyone is able, don't forget to vote on Tuesday if you haven't already. Absolutely, yeah. So here in the United States, tomorrow, Tuesday, is voting day. So if you haven't, definitely get out there and do it. Urban Chicken Mama harvested the rest of the sweet potatoes yesterday. They were small like mine. Hope to find a solution for next year. I'm in 5B. So since I did that video, it's been a week and a half ago now that I did the video on the sweet potatoes that I harvested. And I don't think I've had anyone say that they grew sweet potatoes and got all big sweet potatoes. Almost everybody who has commented about growing sweet potatoes has said that their sweet potatoes were really small. So if you check out that video, you'll see that I was disappointed that my sweet potatoes came out as small as they did, because I started with a pretty big sweet potato. I suspect that it is because the sweet potatoes that are being grown for sale, the big sweet potatoes, are a hybrid of some type. And so, as you know, if you grow a hybrid and then save the seed and then plant the seed, the resulting plant is not going to match the parent plant. And so I suspect that that happened with the sweet potato, that the potato was grown from a slip or a seed or a cutting or some of the methods that they use with sweet potatoes to produce the nice big sweet potato. But then when it sprouted and produced the slips that I then planted, it was essentially like a hybrid. And others that are trying to grow sweet potatoes from the store are finding the same results. So what I'm going to do, to your point, what the solution is, I'm planning on ordering slips this upcoming season, just in a couple months now, and order slips that, based on the description, even though they can be relatively expensive, it can be worth it, I hope, so that I can match it to my climate, match it to my season, and hopefully get those bigger sweet potatoes that I'm after. Rather than rolling the dice and just growing something at random that I don't even know what the variety is from the store, I'll choose a variety that should do well, and then we'll see what the results are. And I'm hoping that the results will definitely be better. So Urban Chicken Mama, that might be something to check out, is look more at the specific varieties and see if you can get one that more closely matches your summer garden, and you might have better success with that. That's what I'm hoping will happen in mine. Okay, Mark is saying, I have leftover cedar wood chips. Can I use these instead of straw to cover strawberries for the winter? Oh, sure, absolutely. The biggest issue when you use any kind of mulch on strawberries is just be careful about covering the crown, that center part of the strawberry. If it's covered and then you get snow and it melts and then the rains come and it starts warming up, you can cause rot in that part of the plant. That crown, if it's covered and gets wet and stays wet, can rot. And so using mulch is fine over the winter, even wood chip mulch on strawberries. Just be careful that when it's assuming that you're in a kind of winter where it's going to freeze and stay cold, but once it starts warming up, do pull back the mulch from around the plant, particularly the crown, so that the mulch doesn't hold in that moisture and cause the crown to rot. So nothing wrong at all. And in cedar, we were talking earlier about the allelopathic properties of the eucalyptus and the black walnut, and cedar kind of falls into that category to some degree, but it's really not as big a concern. And so using cedar wood chips around the strawberries is fine. I would just pull them back from around the plants as springtime approaches. So Robin's Container Garden says, I wish I could grow sweet potatoes here. It's just too cool here. Robin's in a nice, cool, wet location, Scotland. And so that is one of those things that, as I say, you have to match what you watch on YouTube with what you can do. And there's lots of how to grow sweet potato videos out there. And there's mine showing how I grew sweet potatoes. But there's a lot of areas of the world, like Scotland, that it's just not an option unless you can create a fully enclosed artificial environment with extra heating and extra light. It's not worth the effort. So I feel your pain, Robin. There's a lot of things I wish I could grow that I definitely can't, and I accept that. And that's especially for the new gardeners out there. You may have your eye on something you really want to grow. Go for it. Try to grow it. And then you find out whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work, you can try to do something different to try to make it work. But then eventually you find out that there are just some plants that just don't do well in your garden and you give up on it. And I've got a long list of plants like that that I occasionally try again, but for the most part I've just given up on because it doesn't match with my climate. And so I tried sweet potatoes for the first time, knowing that I probably wasn't going to have success. And I was very surprised when I did have success. Okra is another one of those plants that I keep trying. I've only had 1 year where it worked out to the point that I was able to harvest a pretty substantial amount of okra, but it just doesn't match my typical season. Everything has to grow exactly perfectly in my cool season, but short season. And so I was surprised by sweet potatoes, but I'm gonna try it again. Next year may not actually work as well. Thank you. Sista's got an experiment, kept sweet potato leaves and sprouting roots and water inside. We'll plant in the summer, using them now as an indoor foliage plant. Great minds think alike. I almost included that in my sweet potato video, but it was getting long and I cut it out. I did the same thing. So in that video, I show how I put my sweet potato in the soil and started growing the sprouts, and I took those sprouts to become the slips that I grew in my garden. I still have that plant growing. It's a beautiful plant, and I'm using it as an indoor plant right now too, because the foliage really is beautiful. Mine has some purple foliage on it. So yeah, great experiment. I didn't intend mine to be an experiment. I just don't like killing plants, and that sweet potato just kept sending out new sprouts, and it's beautiful. And I've been thinking about doing that on purpose this next year and actually do a video on how you could grow sweet potatoes as an indoor plant just to enjoy the foliage, because it really is a beautiful plant. So good for you. I think that's one of those things that it starts as an experiment, but it may be one of those things that you really like to grow. Carla, when I lived in the Colorado Rockies, I had some plants that I was just not going to be able to grow. No bananas in the mountains. Yeah, my father used to talk about the Montana banana, because you can't grow bananas in Montana unless you got the greenhouse and the controlled situations. But there are no bananas in the mountains of Colorado or Montana or Idaho or anywhere along the Rocky Mountains. It just doesn't work. And Shiny Rock says the same thing. Mission okra impossible in the mountain area. But you can always keep trying. That's what I do. It's that act of craziness that becomes part of gardening, where we know it's not going to work, but we're going to try it again anyway, because you never know, it might possibly have a good year and everything might end up working well. So Jay Dixon, advice: every growing season I try about 4 to 7 new garden techniques to learn new methods. That's a really good suggestion, Jay, and I completely agree with that. That's something I still do, and I make videos about some of those things that do end up working. Trying new things every year. 4 to 7 is really a good target. I like that number, Jay, because it gives you an opportunity to try new things. Some work, some don't, but you learn and you make note of it, maybe make some modifications for next year, and keep trying. So good for you, Jay. And that really is good advice. Thank you for sharing that. Shiny Rocks, true or false, sweet potatoes are not a potato at all. They are not a sweet potato. So that is a true statement. And I talked about that in that video briefly, where I mentioned the difference between the two. That potatoes are tubers, and a tuber is actually part of an underground stem. And so when you plant that little bit of a seed potato and it begins growing, it's that underground stem that then enlarges to become a storage location. That's what a potato is. A sweet potato is only called a sweet potato because it looks like a potato. Completely different. It's actually part of the root structure of the plant, and completely different in the botanical world. Completely different. The only relationship is that they're both called potatoes. So there you have it. It is true. Sweet potatoes are not a potato at all. And how you grow them, or how you plant them for growing is different as well. And I talk about that in that video. So check out that video, because it does tell a little bit more about what they are and what they aren't when it comes to the differences for the sweet potatoes. Chris D, from what I understand, covering rhubarb with a pile of leaves before winter will potentially cause a great increase in the following year's harvest. Yes, potentially, and there's a few reasons for that. Rhubarb, because it's a perennial vegetable, stays in the same spot. And so from one year to the next, it's only absorbing the nutrients from the soil that are there in the soil. It's really difficult to work in compost to your rhubarb. And so one of the best ways to do this, I do this with my asparagus bed in particular. I add leaves every year, and I pile leaves on the asparagus bed. I also add, not as many, but I do the same with my rhubarb as a winter mulch. Well, as those leaves break down, like we were talking about earlier in the beginning, they're going to add nutrients, and they're going to enrich your soil. And they're going to increase the fungal activity in your soil. And so when you pile the leaves on the rhubarb plant, what you're essentially doing to help the plant in the future is you're putting more nutrients back into the soil by allowing those leaves to break down. Now, rhubarb is a very hardy plant. And so it doesn't need the leaves to protect it in most of our gardens. Possibly if you were growing in zone 2 or zone 3, you might need extra protection for your rhubarb. But most of the rhubarb varieties are good down to zone 4. I'm in zone 5. I never cover my rhubarb, and it comes back every year. Very hardy plant. And so as far as the increase in the next year's harvest, I think it's primarily because of the increased soil life and adding those nutrients back to the soil. And that's the only way you can do it in a rhubarb bed, is by putting the nutrients on top of the soil, like a pile of leaves. And it can help protect the crown, kind of like the strawberries. You do have to be careful about the crown of the rhubarb plant, because if it stays covered in early spring when the temperatures start warming, it can also rot. And so do think about pulling back the leaves right at the very center of the plant, where the crown is, where those initial leaves come out when it starts warming up in the springtime. But leave those leaves in place. They'll enrich your soil, and you can hopefully get a bigger increase in the years ahead. So yeah, I think that's actually a good idea, and something that is one I would recommend. I like that. Mola's right here saying hello. I like the wood chip mulch primarily. And so what I do, kind of along the same lines around my rhubarb, is I'll add manure to my wood chips. I'll sprinkle manure on top. Last year I used alpaca manure. I'm planning on doing that again this year, with the same idea, that by adding something on top of the soil that will break down and then enrich the soil underneath, that's the best way to continue adding nutrients to perennial vegetables like rhubarb and asparagus in particular. So Bowtie Life, nice to see you. Enjoyed your last video. Here in Florida, I have trouble keeping up with the okra. Measuring plants in the video soon. Looking at 12 feet or more. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, my okra, I've never been able to get an okra taller than about 3.5 feet. And the 3.5 foot okra only has about 4 or 5 pods on it. So that's why I say I haven't been able to grow it here. But good for you. I'll look forward to seeing that video. And I like how the last video you had some measuring involved. So I like how you're measuring and keeping track of the things you're doing in your videos. I do appreciate that. Thank you, Sunset Gazing. I'll give hugs to Mala. She's going to want me to be playing with her since I've been ignoring her for the last hour and a half. She was definitely in play mode today after we came in from outside. So Sherry is saying, Mark from Self-Sufficient Me did a great vid on adding fire pit ashes, potash over the garden, and watering it in. So I have what I think is a great video on how you have to be careful about that. It's a great idea if you live in a region like Mark does in Australia that has acidic soil. And here in the United States, there are regions of the country where that is a recommended activity, usually in the southern states with acidic soil. The reason it's an issue, and that's what I talk about in the video is actually one of my older videos. I think it's about 4 years old, where I talk about, for me here in Colorado, and many of the rest of us who have an alkaline soil, adding fireplace ashes is really not a good idea. The idea of adding the potassium, the potash, is wonderful, but it increases the pH of the soil. And so if you've got an alkaline soil and you mix in fireplace ashes, you're raising the pH of your soil, making it more alkaline, which actually could increase the pH beyond the range of a lot of the plants we're growing. Now, if you have an acidic soil, like Mark does, and you add the fireplace ashes, those ashes are going to raise the pH. And so you're taking an acidic soil, raising the pH closer to neutral. And so not only does it help with the pH issue of the soil and plants benefit from it, but it's also adding potassium, which could also benefit if your soil is deficient in potassium. So be careful about that. Yes, it's a great idea if you have the right kind of soil to benefit from it. I've had a number of comments from that video from people who said, I added ashes and the next season couldn't grow anything in my garden. Then I did a soil test and found out that I had alkaline soil, and the wood ashes increased alkalinity to the point that it killed all my plants. And so I've had many people tell me that over the years. I've had people here in Colorado that have had that mistake where they couldn't understand why their garden wasn't growing. And when you trace it down to the cause, it's the wood ashes being added to an alkaline soil. So good idea, and it works great for Mark in Australia, but chalk this up to be careful about the information that you get on YouTube and make sure it matches with your garden before you actually put it into practice. So get a soil test first to find out what your pH is, and then decide if you want to add the wood ashes or not. And so as we start thinking about the gardens around the world, I got a great message from George in the Bahamas today. So I wanted to share this with you. So George has a good section of land in the Bahamas, and it was devastated by a hurricane recently. He's doing it over again. He's starting again. And his message to me was his garden was wiped out. He's growing it again thanks to a lot of the advice that I offer. And he invited me to his garden in the Bahamas when he gets it rebuilt. And I would love to go to the Bahamas. And so I think that would be awesome. Maybe at some point in the future, I could do a video visiting George in the Bahamas, because that to me is the epitome of what gardening is all about. When your garden is devastated, when you have nothing left and you're starting over. He sent me a picture of a brand new breadfruit tree that looks like it's only about 2 feet tall that he's got in the ground. When you're starting over and thinking already that you're going to invite people to your garden because you know your garden is going to be looking beautiful, how awesome is that? Yeah, I'm always looking to the future. I always talk about next season and what next season is going to be. And I've had those years with the freeze or with the hail where my garden has been devastated. And it's hard. It's tough. It's easy for people to walk away from that. It's not easy for a gardener to walk away from devastation like that. And so when the hurricane rolled up the East Coast here last month, we talked a little bit about some of you whose gardens were devastated and the recovery. And I just have to take my hat off to you, and especially to George and all the others who aren't giving up. You're a gardener. You are saying, oh, well, I guess this was a bad year, but there's next year and the year after. And to reach out to Gardener Scott and invite him to see your garden when it's nothing now, but you know it's going to be something special in the years ahead, I just love that. It made my day, made my week, made my month, and I just had to share that with you. Just the optimism that gardeners, all of us from around the world, can have when we are confronted by that adversity, when we have to start over. But yet, it's just another gardening day. We'll just put more seeds in the ground and put more breadfruit trees in the ground and just move forward with what we have and with our vision for the future. And so as the cold weather sets in for some of you, as the winter approaches, and for the rest of you like Rick in Australia that are starting your season, always do it with that eye on the future. And I, in the back of my brain, also think if everything failed today, if that hailstorm rolled in and wiped out my garden, what kind of backup do I have? What other plan do I have? I don't think in terms of, man, if my garden wiped out, I would just walk away from it. I'm always thinking about what would happen if, and how can I do this other thing? And like Jay pointed out, with 4 to 7 new things that you're trying, some of the new things I try are weather related because I've had issues with the weather in the past. And be it the plant selection or the hoops or the hailcloth or whatever it is you're using, try those new things with that thought in mind that, like George, you could have your garden wiped out overnight just by a hurricane, a storm, a freeze. Who knows what it could be? Some of you in the last year in particular in Oregon had issues with the wildfires moving through. There's always something that could impact your garden. So how are you going to recover from that? And are you going to be a gardener like George, who just shirks it off and looks to the future and already has that plan in place for when the garden has fully recovered? Well, I have no doubt that you have that in you. And if you don't think it's in there, bring it out, because it is. Because you're a gardener, and that's just what gardeners do. Thanks so much for everybody being here. It's cold outside. I'm going to be doing an inside gardening day. I imagine many of you are as well. But use the next week between now and when we get together next Monday to learn more about gardening and start thinking about what you're going to do next year, in the next season, or in this season as you are enjoying the warm temperatures you have. Just keep learning, keep trying, keep doing, and keep being the wonderful gardeners that you are. I'll see you here next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Above all, enjoy gardening.